Dyer, who is a member here. She comes here most every day. You'll see her upstairs playing pool or doing Zumba or other things. But today she's here on behalf of herself and the Walpole Historical Commission. She recently published a book about ice harvesting, and she's going to talk about it today.
Yes.
Here you go, Betsy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to tell you about 4 Walpole ponds that were important for ice harvesting. But I want to first tell you, because some of you know Roger Turner Jr., who died last year. He put me onto this topic. Roger said 3 years ago, I guess, I'd like you to write about ice harvesting. His family, as you will find out, was very involved in ice harvesting on 2 ponds in Walpole, and we only had 4 major ponds. So this is for Roger Turner Jr., whom some of you knew. And in addition to 4 ponds, I'm going to mention Ellis Pond, which I know you're saying, wait a minute, isn't that in Norwood? Yeah, I'm going to explain that to you. Don't worry. Ellis Pond in Norwood, in Plimpton's Farm Pond. And I'm mentioning Plimpton's Farm Pond because it came up in conversations as possibly being an ice harvesting pond. And I want to just clarify some things about that as well. All right, where did I get this quote for the title? I read a lot of newspapers from the 19th century. I love reading 19th century newspapers. And Diamond Pond, which is one of our featured ponds, was described in 1888 as being of wonderful purity. And I got to thinking, I wonder if the name Diamond Pond was about the purity of the water. But I think you'll see that it's actually quite a diamond-shaped pond. I'll show you a couple of maps of it. All right, I'm going to briefly tell you how ice harvesting was done. Very briefly, it will be too brief for people who are fans of ice harvesting. Sorry, I'm going to first show you an ice house, and notice the ramp where ice is being hauled up. This is from Roger Turner Jr. I think it's in Milton that this picture was taken, and you can see at least 4 men there. 5 men diligently working. There would be gangs of dozens and dozens of men working on ice harvesting. It was a huge, huge production, very time sensitive. When the ice was ready, they had to get out there and cut it and haul it essentially around the clock. Just like haying. If anyone grew up on a farm and did any kind of haying, you know that was very time sensitive too, bringing in the hay. Whoops, I just went in the wrong direction. Okay, first step, we've got a horse here, and that horse has a plow-like contraption. It's scoring the ice. It's not cutting all the way through. If it were, the horse would fall in, right? So the horse with the help of the people, is scoring the ice and marking out nice squares and rectangles that are going to be cut later. So first step is to do that. Actually, first step is to measure all that ice, which they did, and then to score it with this plow-like contraption. The horse wore special horseshoes, and the people had special contraptions on their boots to keep them from slipping. And then came out these gigantic saws, and we have a couple of these saws at the Walpole Historical Society. They're so heavy, I'm fairly strong. I can't pick up the end of this saw very easily. These things are huge. I don't know how these men were doing it, but the weight of the saw probably brought it down, and then they hauled it back up and brought it down. So what they did was they cut the ice in strips. And there I am holding another really heavy device. That's me at Clark Pond holding an ice splitter. And what would happen next is a man would stand and chop down the strips into squares. So lift it up, boom, down it would go. And it's heavy enough that you can imagine it just splitting the ice into squares. Then the ice would go down a channel, helped along by all sorts of contraptions like this, pokers and picks, toward the ice house. And where's the channel? The channel is where the ice used to be, the water channel. All right, and that's all I'm going to do on ice harvesting, how it's done. Okay, there's an entire lecture that could be done there. There's all sorts of techniques, but I need to get into our 4 ponds and how we did it. And I'm calling it our unique history of ice harvesting, and I'll tell you why. It's because of the nature of our ponds. Now, we start South Walpole is way down here. South Walpole's not on this map, but we've got 3 ponds in South Walpole. They're all mill ponds, dammed up Neponset River water, yes? Now we're making our way up. There's the Neponset River. We've got Blackburn Pond, upper and lower, Union Pond. We've got another mill pond on the Neponset. We get up to Stetson's Pond, we get up into East Walpole, we've got Plimpton Pond, we've got Bird Pond. What do they have in common? They're all dammed up parts of the Neponset River, and each one has some kind of industry upstream of it, putting its pollution down the river, and that's significant to Walpole history. And then we've got a couple of tributaries. So see Maury's Pond there? That's Turner's Pond. I'm going to call it Maury's Pond because for the history of ice harvesting, it was called Maury's Pond. It's on a tributary, and then we've got Clark's Pond and Diamond Pond. I know they don't look quite like the right shapes on this picture. They're coming in on a tributary too. Similar problems though with any dammed up river in the 19th century. If they're damming it up, there's probably an industry there and it's probably polluting whatever is downstream. All right, now let me show you what some other towns have got that Walpole doesn't. Glacier ponds, deep glacial kettle ponds. And this is a map showing all the major kettle ponds in Massachusetts. The glacier came and just created all these ponds. Where's Walpole? Right here where it's empty. So I know some of you are saying, wait a minute, don't we have a couple of kettle ponds in the Walpole woods? Yeah, we do, but they're small, very small. We do not have any gigantic kettle ponds in Walpole. And that's where the original ice harvesters who were doing it on a huge scale were going. They were going to these places north of us for the most part, but also down on the Cape and going for the kettle ponds. So by the time we get to Walpole's history of ice harvesting, it was more about things were so scaled up that these major ice companies were looking for just one more pond and one more pond. They were making money off of this, so they started to look at Walpole's mill ponds. All right, so we begin with Maury's Pond. Maury's is actually not out. Remember, this is Turner's Pond now, for those of you who know that. Maury's Pond is not the very first, but it's close to the first. It was the pond on which the most extensive ice harvesting occurred. Begins around 1881, which is relatively late. Why? Because they were going for the glacial ponds before they were going to something like Maury's. And I want to show you an interesting map because I know some of you know this pond pretty well. I've put some red things in here. These are my indications so you can orient yourself. Skating cabin, because there's Elm Street right along there. Mill Pond Road, right along there. Wasn't called that in those days. What's that? That's an island. Can you believe that? There was an island in Maury's Pond, or Turner's Pond. It's now a little peninsula. In the late 20th century, it got kind of filled in, if you know what I mean, and there's some building around there, et cetera, et cetera. Couldn't do that now with the Conservation Commission, but it's kind of filled in, and it's also about water levels in the pond. So there actually was a little island there. So that's a trivial thing that you'll know that people outside of this lecture will not. Was there ever an island in Turner's Pond? Yes, there was. All right. And here is an 1882 depiction of what was along Mill Pond Road at the edge of Maury's Pond, and it was a huge wool scouring mill and gigantic ice houses. These were some of the biggest ice houses around. See those great big square things without windows? And what's that in the background? A train track. So it was ideally situated. You've got the pond for the ice, you've got the ice houses, and you've got the train track because this was a huge operation. They were hauling most of that ice to Boston or Providence or elsewhere. Oh, which direction? Say that again? Yeah. Oh, okay, where's the train going? The train's going, oh, okay, so this is Mill Pond Road. See this little, so, yeah, so we're looking at Mill Pond Road. The pond is to our left, the big two-lobed pond. And then that's still a freight train track, some of you might know. So probably about the best situation you could have for hauling out huge amounts of ice. All right, another little orientation. Again, I've put some red on here. This is, those of you who know Roger Turner Jr., that's where he lived, yeah? Here's Mill Pond Road. Here's where the ice house was. Here's where the mill site was. Here's the railroad that we still have. I can't tell you all about everything here. Gill's Pond, you can ask me another time. Here's what the island looks like today. See how it's a peninsula? Okay. And here is the original Turner home called Lakeview or Elm Crest. Just to get you oriented. That's the pond we're talking about. What else did I want to say about that? No, that's it for the moment. All right, here's a wonderful set of quotations from the newspaper in the 1880s that gives you a feel for how time-sensitive this operation was and how many people would be involved. 60 men employed, working around the clock, aided by moonlight, and probably also kerosene lanterns and probably a bonfire on the shore so they could warm up. Mr. Lewis, that's the owner of this operation at this point, providing hot chocolate, sandwiches, and cheese. 6,000 tons cut and put away in those massive ice houses. And by the way, very little of it delivered to Walpole. It was for going elsewhere. And a huge crowd, including not a few ladies, assembled to watch. So they would walk down from the center of town. It must have been quite the thing to watch. To this day, if you get to see an ice harvest way up north being done as a demonstration, it's worth looking at. So that's from the Walpole Star, and it probably applies to almost any major ice harvest in Walpole or anywhere around. As I said, time sensitive. When the ice is ready, you got to get out there and bring it in, lest it melt in a few days. Could have a warm spell. All right, so I'm mentioning Fred Hartshorn's name here just in passing because you're going to see him at Diamond Pond, and Diamond Pond has its own particular little problems that we're going to deal with. Fred Hartshorn suddenly is now working with Lewis at this operation at Maury's Pond. Okay? Now, here begins a costly and acrimonious lawsuit. Look, it goes on for 5 years. The lawyers were getting paid right and left. And I can tell you, because I've read the newspaper accounts, a lot of lawyers, a lot of deep pockets, a lot of really unpleasant things said about people in the newspaper. It was Lewis, that's the person who's operating the ice harvesting, and also a wool scouring mill. More about that. Versus, here are some names you recognize: Bird, Vose, that's Hollingsworth and Vose, East Walpole, Stetson, and others. So let's say every single mill owner downstream of him, all right? And they had some deep pockets and some serious lawyers. So back to this, let me remind you, not only did E. Frank Lewis have ice houses, but he had this great big complex here, which is a wool scouring mill. And the lawsuit was about him polluting all the businesses downstream with his wool scouring mill. And I know you're thinking to yourself, how bad could it be, right? They're cleaning wool. That's what wool scouring is. They're cleaning wool, right? How heavy a pollutant could that be? Well, description in a court transcript. We actually have a court transcript from some of the trials. Great quantities of grease and sheep dung, I'll explain that in a second, and other substances not readily identified called lumps of animal matter. So here's where you have to, if you've ever seen a sheep being sheared at a country fair, they have washed that sheep, they have fluffed that sheep up, they brought that sheep over, and they make a little demonstration. Everything comes off clean and pretty, right? No, this is a massive, massive operation, and yes, the back end of a sheep can sometimes get some dung all kind of clotted in there, and they can make some mistakes as they're clipping, and there is actually quite a lot of grease and wool. That's what you're actually cleaning out. So all this was going into the water, and he was doing 9.5 tons of wool per day, can you imagine? And using 57 pounds of soap per day. This was in the court transcript. All going downstream in the direction of Stetson, Bird, and all those folks. Here's the contraption that he would be using in his mill, where the wool is going from one place to another. So we're not talking about hand washing, we're talking about massive, massive quantities, and then all the water is going out into the river. And I just want to show you that here's Maury's, here's the wool scouring mill, here's the pollutant coming down the stream, here it is making a little detour because the water's flowing in that direction, heading right for Stetson's Pond, heading to East Walpole. E. Frank Lewis's father, Bradford, had a mill. That wasn't being affected, was it? It was just upstream. And his brother had a mill, also just upstream, and his uncle had a mill just upstream. So no one in the Lewis family was being affected by this. Only these folks. This actually, let's say the hard feelings lasted for a whole lot longer than 5 years over this. The entire Lewis family was sitting in a pretty good position there, and no one else was. All right, so what happened? 1890, Lewis actually got essentially run out of town. I mean, that's maybe putting it a little bit too strongly, but he had to leave town, okay? And he abandoned his wool scouring business, and then he went and built mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And also in 1893, Horace Spear, again, Diamond Pond, who had previously been at Diamond Pond, suddenly was available to take over the business that E. Frank Lewis had abandoned. Okay? Stay tuned for the reason of that. Now, you're probably feeling sorry for E. Frank Lewis. I don't know. Maybe depends on how you are with the Lewises. But if you're feeling sorry, don't. So if you go up to the Lawrence Historical Society, which I have, and you ask about E. Frank Lewis, they think he's their guy. And maybe he is because we ran him out of town, right? So they think he's their guy. He had a huge complex up there. That's E. Frank Lewis's mill in Lawrence. So he went up there and he did extremely well for himself. And he's apparently got a famous mansion up there as well. So don't feel sorry for him, but the ice business will continue after he's gone. So there's Spear, who has just become available to continue E. Frank Lewis's ice business. There's the sort of advertisement that he would have taken out in the directory, and usually something boastful about 12,000 tons in his ice houses on Morey's Pond. And here we just happen to have old insurance maps of some of these ice houses. And notice it's just really kind of a big square windowless nondescript building. This is an 1894 insurance map. The 1899 one is similar. Next door, by the way, is the mill, which is now being rented out for some other things. And here come the Turners. Anyone who's ever wondered how the Turners arrived to town, it was secretly. Why? Because they were I'm going to say a very, very rich family from Milton who had made a fortune in ice, an absolute fortune, all over New England, and all they were doing was looking for more ponds. And they wanted to do it on the secret because just like any kind of big industry, you don't want to announce, here I am in town, I'm buying up the rights to a pond, then the prices are all going to go up, yes? So Spear quietly added a partner, Jacob Arthur Turner, that's Roger Turner Jr.'s grandfather from Milton, who, by the way, didn't hang around in town much. This was just one of his many, many, many ponds. Okay? And by 1896, it was called the Walpole Ice Company, Turner and Spear, yet most people in town didn't realize that Turner was even around. This took me a while to figure out. And one of many, many ice house fires. I'm mentioning it partly because it was a spectacular fire. It was in 1900. It was here that they were mentioning Turner in the newspaper for the first time, but notice how they say a gentleman by the name of Turner who resides in Milton, right? So he wasn't even there that night when the big ice houses went up. Spectacular ice house fires, and then they immediately rebuilt. Immediately. I mean, within months they would have the entire structure rebuilt, which always amazes me. Every ice house fire that I've read about, they start rebuilding practically the next day. And by 1900, right after this ice house fire, Jacob Arthur Turner of Milton Ice owned the entire business and all the property. I mean, the entire shoreline. I mean, all the land around it. I mean, the pond itself, of course. Everything. And yet, I'm still thinking most people in town didn't realize it because it was still being run by town folks. All right, but here's the 1911 insurance map, and C.J. Arthur Turner has got his name on the ice house. This is the one that he had to rebuild after it burned. And we've got a couple of kind of not really wonderful pictures of the Turner Ice House at Maury's. What you can see is they typically have a ramp going up high because the ice is loaded that way. This is not the most wonderful picture, nor is this one, but we were lucky to have any sort of pictures. I think we're looking across the pond at the ice house complex there in that picture. All right, let's get to 1930, when Jacob Arthur Turner's son, Roger Turner, married Louise Lambert, and they came to live at Lakeview, which is the original Turner house overlooking the pond, and Roger Turner was born 1932. No, it isn't the show house on Route 27. That's the Dalton Estate? No, Dutton Estate. The Dutton Estate. No, it's not the Dutton Estate. It's a very nice house, though. Okay. And surprising, this was a surprise to pretty much everyone that I discussed ice with. Very shortly after, Milton Ice began making artificial ice. So that if you're of a certain age and you remember ice being delivered, it might have been artificial ice, because I know pretty much what people's ages are, plus or minus, right? This being the senior center. So it was starting to be artificial ice in the 1920s and 1930s because it was more reliable, because you didn't have to get a gang of men out there at a moment's notice, and because you could have it year-round, and more people were starting to depend on it year-round. So notice the advertisement said no ice shortage will be felt in Walpole. That was the real push for artificial ice. So even though the Turners owned ice ponds all over the place, they were starting to supplement with artificial ice. And in fact, they had an ice plant up in Mattapan, no longer in existence. I've gone up there looking for remnants of it. It's now a residential neighborhood. But they had an ice house up in Mattapan, an ice manufacturing plant up in Mattapan. They were based in Milton. The whole family is based in Milton. In fact, the original Turner's Pond is in Milton. If you go look up Turner's Pond. Mattapan's very close to Milton. Yeah.
No, but I think there are a lot of companies that start out with a name based on where their address is.
Yeah.
And they regret it because they expanded way beyond that, like Milton all the way to Walpole.
Well, they had a worse problem. They need to ditch the word ice in a few minutes. You'll see. Because after a while, no one wants ice anymore, do they? Okay, and here we're coming up on the last ice harvest. It was 1936. It's the first memory of 4-year-old Roger Turner Jr. I wish he were here. And then it was followed by one of the largest fires in Walpole history, another ice house. It was the ice house. Of course, there was another huge fire later. That was an ice house, too. These ice houses would go up like, just because they were great big empty buildings with really wonderful ventilation, like a chimney made out of wood. Roger's memory is that the workers, his family's workers, sat him on an ice block as a 4-year-old, all bundled up, I hope, and sent him on a ride down carefully, I hope. I say that as a mother. They'd have been watching that 4-year-old as he went down the stream toward the ice house, taking a ride on the ice block. Roger told me about that. But it's his last memory of a real ice harvest, because then they had a fire a few months later. Oh, in case you're feeling sorry for Roger's father, Roger Turner Sr., is anyone feeling sorry for him? I actually think, and I've confirmed this with Roger, his son, that it wasn't the disaster you might think that he lost the ice house and that part of the ice business. He was an Olympic ice skater. That's what he really wanted to do with Turner's Pond or Maury's Pond. So I'm not going to read out this whole thing out loud. I could actually make this much, much longer. I'm just trying to impress you. He is called the first great American figure skater. And mind you, he was doing it on pond ice. Nowadays, great American figure skaters have to have perfectly groomed ice, don't they? Right? No, we're talking about pond ice here. So when Roger Turner Jr. says he knew how to groom pond ice so you could skate on it, he was not kidding. He knew how to make that surface so that you could do some fancy things. And look at him. Figure skating championships, Olympics, pairs championships, Olympics again. And then I love this, he remains tied with Dick Button for the most consecutive U.S. championship wins. Roger Turner told me an anecdote about that. Don't know if this is printed anywhere else, so you might be hearing it for the first time, that Roger Turner Sr. was very, very good at figures. That means actually literally making a figure in the ice. Dick Button was not. And so Dick Button, little by little, lobbied to remove figures from the championship or have it weighted less. So little by little, Dick Button caught up with Roger Turner because it was more about doing this and not about this fancy stuff. So to this day, you don't see actual figures in a figure skating competition, but you used to, and that was his specialty. And so as soon as the ice house burned down, Roger Turner Sr. Started putting on huge ice shows. I mean, gigantic ice shows. If you want to read a lot more about it, I actually have an entire chapter in my book on these ice shows. It's too much of a digression, but his very first one, and when I say gala and star-studded, he knew people in the Olympics. He knew champions. They came to Walpole and put on shows on what was more and more being called Turner's Pond, because the Turners were certainly all over it. Didn't become officially Turner's Pond until the 1940s. Went before the Board of Selectmen. They said, yeah, okay. Just one example. Here are some of the skaters that he had. This is the Walpole Times headline, Galaxy of Stars and the Ice Carnival. And he did this for year after year after year on pond ice. Can you imagine? At night with lighting. But look, remember I said Milton Company is going to ditch the word ice? Yeah, they did. By and by, nobody wanted ice anymore. They have refrigeration, yeah? And so, notice it's formerly the Milton Ice Company. This is in the 1940s. They started to specialize in fuels, whether it was home heating fuels or fuels for industry and that sort of thing. So they continued to make money hand over fist, but it wasn't so much with ice anymore. All right, on to Diamond Pond. A year ahead of Maury's Pond. I don't know if you remember the dates, but what I want you to see with those bracket dates, why did suddenly we stop harvesting ice at Diamond Pond in 1892? That seems like a fairly short stint of ice harvesting in a supposedly wonderful pond, yeah? All right, first of all, let's see what Diamond Pond looks like. It's kind of diamond shape, at least in that picture. And by the way, that's Clark's Pond further down, further upstream actually. And another picture, looking kind of diamond shaped there. And there was a cotton mill at the pond. So if you can read that fine print, it says the Diamond Cotton Mills. By the way, the two channels coming out, that's very typical for a water-powered mill structure. They've got to control the water going over the dam, so they have a way of having the water bypass it if they need to. So very often an active mill site will have 2 or 3 channels coming out of it. So it starts in 1880 with Fred Hartshorn, and he has Julius Guild working with him, delivering ice. So this was a much more local enterprise. They were not hauling it away to Boston or New York. And then by and by, Julius Guild took it over for a short time, and he was a dairyman. And that's actually significant because more and more dairies needed to have ice. I think they've always needed to have some form of cooling their milk, but more and more dairies were relying on ice. So oftentimes you'll see a dairy farmer in Walpole with a small ice house to keep his milk cool or his butter cool. So Julius Guild actually was a dairy person. And then 1887, we have Horace Spear stepping in, and in just a few short years, he's not going to have any more ice business there anymore. Advertisement from the directory. There's Fred Hartshorn, dealer in ice. I like to look through the old directories, and that's E. Frank Lewis's Uncle Willard up there with the cotton batting that became Kendall Mills. There's Julius Guild. Notice how they keep using the same pictures over and over because they weren't exactly out there snapping pictures of things. Pure Pond ice delivered in town. And you can actually, I know you probably can't see it from the back row or even front, the ice house is actually labeled there. So good place for an ice house, right at the edge and right near the road. And that's Old Diamond Street. If you've ever been on Diamond Street, you know you can take that little detour and you're on Old Diamond Street, which is in not really great shape at this particular point. All right, here's what happened. A brand new railroad line opened February of 1892, it was the brand new East Walpole Branch Railroad finally going to the Bird, Plant, and to Hollingsworth and Vose. And up to that point, there had been quite a lot of contention about the fact that they did not have a proper railroad to those two mills. So this was a major thing for them. But it was also a major thing for a lot of people in town as to exactly how the railroad was going to go to East Walpole. The railroad was buying up property from people. So some people wanted to jack the price up and have the railroad come through their particular property, maybe some crummy piece of property, but now suddenly the price was up, they could get more money from the railroad. Some people wanted the railroad to go by their business, not just the Bird and Hollingsworth and Bose. Some people didn't want the railroad to go by. It was going to inconvenience something that they were doing. So there was a lot of jockeying around where the railroad track was actually going to be laid. Which railroad? It's the rail trail out back here. Okay. So you know we've got a rail trail. Make sure I need to get a water. You know we've got a rail trail. And I just, I'll talk while I reattach my sandals. Sorry. I'm sure everyone needs a break from me nattering away anyway. The new sandals with an issue. Thank you, but all right. Sorry, here I am back. All right. I'm very big on how do I know what I know, and I'm going to explain to you how I know that this was a controversial route for the railroad. COA is Council on Aging. So here we are on South Street, yeah? Here's Common Street. Here's Diamond Pond. Here's the railroad coming in straight like we know it does. Here it is going toward Diamond Pond. Now I know you're saying, it's got to get to East Walpole. It's got to turn somewhere. Yeah, but where's it going to turn? Where exactly is it going to turn? Folks at Diamond Pond want to turn exactly there. So boom, it goes. I'll show you another one that's even more convincing. It turns and it goes across Diamond Pond. In the railroad, the story is, had to be kind of convinced to do that because they had to build a railroad trestle across Diamond Pond in order to do that, which is still there today. So a little extra expense. Maybe they could have done it otherwise, but the folks at Diamond Pond wanted that because that was going to be how they were going to haul their ice away. Another picture. This one's probably exaggerated, but here we are, boom, across Diamond Pond. See Diamond Pond up there? Okay, I don't think this one's really accurate, but it's approximately where we take this detour, okay, to get to this business. So suddenly the ice on Diamond Pond couldn't be sold, and this is a rumor around the Historical Society. When I was working on this, people were saying, you realize that suddenly you couldn't have Diamond Pond ice anymore. I'm like, how do you know this? I really am a stickler about how do we know this stuff? All right, does anyone know the Spear family? All the way up to Spear Hardware downtown. So Carl West, whom some of you know because he hangs around the senior center sometimes, heard this from Bob Spear, who I think heard it from his grandfather. So I'm actually convinced that we've got enough of a chain of evidence here of the Spear family passing down a good story. Because I'll tell you, there's nothing in the newspaper about it. There's no documentation at the Historical Society. So that was really driving me crazy. I was like, how do we even know that this happened? And then what? What happened? Well, the first train went across in February of 1892. And it was carrying a lot of freight. Either if it goes up a steep grade or carries a lot of freight, it's going to be putting out a lot of soot and ashes and smoke. And the story is from the Spears that it ruined the ice, that you could not have that train go there spewing out smoke in the middle of this pond and ruining the ice that was supposed to be of some kind of pure quality. So that's the rumor. Now there's a few corollaries. The Spears said, well, maybe the railroad wanted to cross, maybe we weren't sure they wanted to cross, but at any rate, that ruined the ice at Diamond Pond, and that was the end of the business. There was not another single harvest after 1892 at Diamond Pond. And that's why Horace Spear was suddenly available to go over to Maury's Pond just in time, because remember, E. Frank Lewis had just been run out of town, or was about to be run out of town. Now, there's the railroad trestle that I'm talking about. It cuts across Diamond Pond. Carl West took that photo. And just to kind of orient you, here's Old Diamond Street. Of course, that railroad is no longer active, but you can go and take a look, and you know there's a railroad that went through there. So here it is, cutting the diamond shape of Diamond Pond. Okay? If you haven't gone to Old Diamond Street recently, go have a look. Okay? And the ice house location is kind of at that little parking lot that's where Old Diamond Street and Diamond Street intersect. So it happens that my daughter Alice is a filmmaker in New York and has a professional drone. So whenever Alice visits, I say, bring your drone, I have assignments for you. So we're actually standing, this is Old Diamond Street, we're standing there, you can hardly see us, we're just little dots, because this drone is a few thousand feet up in the air. It's actually a very good drone. This is what Diamond Pond looks like nowadays. Here's the old railroad line going through. We're not sure what this is because we couldn't get over there. The beauty part of a drone is you can get to places that you're not supposed to go because this is all private property around here. Here's a surprise though. Did you know there's a little boardwalk going across that tip of Diamond Pond? That's off of Center Lane. Anyway, that's what modern day Diamond Pond looks like, and it's pretty eutrophied. It's pretty full of pond vegetation and sedimentation. And when you see it from the road, you have no idea that it's as large as that. All right, on to Clark's Pond, also called Spring Brook. Relatively late in the game, and I'm going to explain why. 1899 is kind of late to be getting going with ice harvesting, and then it goes to 1944. Guess what? Another giant ice house fire is going to happen. I'll foreshadow that. All right, and here, if you're probably aware there are two lobes to Clark's Pond, but you'll see it depicted as though it didn't have two lobes, so my arrow is pointing to, that's wrong. The ponds are connected. The two parts of Clark's Pond are connected. And the smaller lobe to the right is the original Clark's Pond. And the larger lobe that we see as we're driving down Stone Street is the newer part of Clark's Pond. And it's a partial explanation for why ice harvesting came in relatively late to this pond. So here we are. Here's Diamond Pond again. Remember I said that's Clark's Pond there? See how it doesn't look like Clark's Pond? Just a little kind of a teardrop? Yeah, that's the original small lobe of Clark's Pond. There was no big lobe of Clark's Pond. Again, same thing. Not a great picture for Diamond Pond, but just one lobe for Clark's Pond. That's around 1888. All right. So around 1888, a guy named Clark, who had a sawmill, made some improvements. And among other things, he dammed up the small lobe of Clark's Pond in such a way that he caused another great big pond to form. And actually, when you're driving down Stone Street, past Hub Grinding, you're actually on one of his dams. That actually is a dam. That keeps that bigger lobe back. And he redirected Spring Brook. Yeah, he redirected Spring Brook. This took me a while to figure out. Spring Brook is the tributary that comes in through Memorial Pond into the Neponset in the middle of town. So again, here's the original Clark's Pond, and the original Spring Brook came out around here. Okay? And that's probably why there's a weird little crook up there as it continues. And the new, and by new I mean 1888, the new Clark's Pond, the one that you know and love, across from Hub Grinding, was formed by a dam here and a dam there. So it's a major, major operation for Clark. And I think I'm going to go to the second one where I've got this thing labeled, but that's Hub Grinding there, 290 Stone Street. There are 3 outlets here. Did you know that? So here's the outlet that they call Spring Brook, but it didn't used to be Spring Brook. It's actually the wasteway for the mill. Remember, they redirected. Tail race of the mill actually goes under Hub Grinding, although it's hard to see anymore that it does. I've actually been in Hub Grinding with the owner, Glenn Maffey, see if we can figure out where it's going. We know the water's going somewhere, and then there's another canal that went down to a sawmill. So it's actually a very, very interesting pond if you like mill ponds. But let's get to ice harvesting. So round about 1899, Clark started the Springbrook Ice Company, Springbrook Company. And we have evidence of them cutting ice, and this is delivery to Walpole households for the most part. I'll show you a beautiful picture that we have at the Historical Society of the Springbrook Ice Company out and about delivering ice to households. And little by little, you might recognize these names, Philip Allen and Charles Gilmore. That's Gilmore of Gilmore's, okay? Gilmore's grain supply store. Little by little, not real overtly, I had to really research this in the Registry of Deeds, Clark transferred the ice business over to them. So it's kind of tricky to figure out who owned what and when unless you know how to do a little bit of deed research. Again, this was done on the sly. I think when people go around buying businesses, they don't always like to advertise it. Sometimes done kind of subtly. Beautiful picture of the Springbrook ice wagons, early 20th century. Probably no one here remembers horse-drawn ice wagons, but you might remember some other versions of that. And people would put in their window an indication of how much ice they wanted, how many pounds of ice they wanted, so that the ice person would come around and bring out the correct number of blocks or size of blocks. However, Springbrook is a really common name for ice companies. When I saw this online, I said, oh my goodness, I see the Springbrook ice. No, it turns out it's from New Britain, Connecticut, alas. But this is, I'm telling you, if you find in your attic or garage or basement a Springbrook Walpole Ice Company card, I want you to donate it to the Walpole Public Library. I do not want you to throw it away. Okay, so somewhere in this town, there's got to be some cards or a card for our Springbrook Ice Company, because it was a completely ubiquitous system of indicating how much ice you want. All right, now, where are we? There was an ice house right about where the hub grinding is now. I keep referring to it. It's 290 Stone Street. So this is Stone Street right here. Here's the big lobe of Clark's Pond. And can you see a ramp there? So they were hauling ice up from the pond across Stone Street, which, by the way, was not called Stone Street in those days. It was actually just kind of a muddy dirt road, into the ice house that's essentially where hub grinding is right now. So that was the original ice house there. Now, here, we're up to 1918. Here is the ice house. Notice how they're calling that Charlevoix Place? That's a joke. Okay, it was a dirt road, so they gave it a highfalutin French name. It was not called Stone Street in those days. It's kind of an inside joke. So, Stone Street, yeah. And then here's the big Springbrook Ice Company ice house that became their main ice house across the pond. And I'll show you some nice pictures of that because it's in the 20th century. All right, so we have two ice houses, a small one. We have a slaughterhouse next door. That was convenient. I won't get into that whole business, but the slaughterhouse and the ice house went hand in hand. And then we've got a brand new gigantic ice house right there across the pond. 1927, the small ice house is gone. Big ice house is still there, the one that if it hadn't burned down, we'd be able to see it. Here is a picture, probably circa 1920s, when they say view from a dam. We're talking about, I think, the little dam that separates the small and the large lobe. And you can see actually a beautiful picture of how the apparatus would take the ice up on a ramp. That ice house looks like it's in pretty good shape, 1920s. However, they were already making artificial ice there, or actually storing artificial ice, not making it, and under contract with the Milton Ice Company. It's the Turners again. Okay, so they're making ice up in Mattapan, bringing it down to Walpole, storing it at Springbrook, and then delivering it out in those charming ice wagons. Took me a while to figure that out. And then they auctioned it off quietly to the Turners. So again, the Turners are, so even Roger wasn't really sure about this. Roger, that his family had gone and bought up another pond, but they did. So they owned both Turner's Pond and Clark's Pond by 1937. beautiful watercolor by a Walpole High School student. Well, he had graduated by that point, but a young person, of the Clark Pond Ice House. Again, different angle, but you can just really, really nice picture. George Percy. Looked him up, found out he was just a Walpole person. But it was the Great Depression, so he couldn't make a living doing art, right? So I said, oh my goodness, he must be some kind of an artist. Nah, he graduated from high school, and then suddenly it was the Great Depression. You couldn't be making a living doing watercolors. And then two more high school students, Ed Ronsky and Ed Bodge, who lived in the neighborhood, took some of the last photographs of an ice harvest in Walpole, and they were probably working there because this is the sort of thing high school boys would love to do, is go work at an ice harvest. So these are pictures by these two high school students, and by then they don't have horses. They have a gasoline-powered device to score the ice. This is 1940. And nice picture of people moving the ice along through a channel toward the big ramps. If you know the Burtwells, that's Katie and John Burtwell's house in the back on Lake Avenue. Yep. Little more from the two high school boys taking pictures and working there. Little boy there, I've asked Roger, is that you by chance? Roger doesn't remember if he was at this harvest or not, but his family owned it by then, so I'll bet he was at this harvest. And now look, that looks pretty decrepit, doesn't it? That looks like it's going to go up in flames, doesn't it? Yeah, and it does. Now there were, according to my father who grew up in this era, they either went up from arson or mistakes, right? Someone was carrying a kerosene lantern in there and it tipped over. But arson was huge in the 1940s. He grew up in Framingham. They had big ice houses all over the place, and it was kind of a spectacle to see these big ice houses go up. So, well, some were insured, some weren't. So if I show you a Sanborn insurance map, it means it's insured. So Clark's and, so they weren't all insured. I can tell you the one down in South Walpole was not insured. No, at some point, well, okay, so Roger said it could be a disgruntled employee. It could be just some kids. It could be some tramps who set a fire on a cold night, and that happened. I don't think anyone was burning. I didn't come across anyone burning for insurance money in Walpole. And I read quite a lot of news articles trying to figure out what was going on with some of this stuff. 1944, spectacular blaze that could be seen as far as Norwood, witnessed by Mariana Pascucci Burtwell, so that's Katie and John's mother and Katie's mother-in-law, 1920 to 2010. So she was a witness as a young woman of this, and according to her, and again, this is not written anywhere, so you're hearing it for the first time, it actually wasn't arson, and it wasn't a mistake. It was a controlled burn. In those days, if you wanted to get rid of a building, you'd do a controlled burn. I know it's hard to believe now the fire department would not let you do a controlled burn of a giant ice house, but 1944, yeah. And it got out of control. They were going to just kind of have it come down in an easygoing kind of way, and it didn't. So who was doing the controlled burn? Roger's family, right? Okay. Roger learned a lot about his family from this. Okay, and then this is one of the first conservation properties purchased in Walpole. Conservation commissions were just coming into their own, and notice the matching price that we got. And one of the people who helped to move that along was the teenager who took a lot of the photos of the last ice harvest. So that is one of our original conservation areas in town, the Clark's Pond Conservation Area. And you can still go into the woods and see the foundation of, this is the only place in town where you can go and see ice house foundations. Look how simple it is. I'd say maybe another 20 years you might not be able to see it, right? There's going to be a lot of sediment on top of that, and tree roots. But very, very simple foundations and just a whole lot of wood. So that's why these things were going up in flames when it was time to do that. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Another picture of the foundation. If you're the sort of person who has a GPS and wants to go and find this exact place, in the appendix of my book, I give you the GPS coordinates for the various things that I'm showing you. part of the old ramp. Obviously just a very small part of it at the edge of the pond. All right, Ellis Pond. It's in Norwood, and it's in the 1860s. Look at that. Here's an 1852 map, and guess what this is? This is Ellis Pond that you know from Norwood, right on the border of Walpole, because the border changed. The original border was such that a good part of the shoreline of Ellis Pond was in Walpole. All right? A lot of people don't know that. And so when the Ellises established their ice harvesting business in the 1860s, they were actually the first in Walpole. Now, I'm not giving them a whole lot of credit because in no time at all they changed the boundary, and so that major ice harvesting operation really ended up in Norwood, and all the information on that is up there. So 1860s, by 20 years it predates anything that was going on in Walpole. But in 1876, Norwood was incorporated, right? They just had some kind of a 150th or something. And that's when the boundary changed, and that's why Ellis Pond and the entire ice business went to Norwood. All right? So that's all I'm going to say about it. Except there's a picture, 1923 Sanborn map, so it was insured. If you see Sanborn, you know it's insured. But by then, it's already in Norwood. So here's a riddle that you can try out at the next Walpole Historical Society party, or let's say you're playing pool or something, Rick, and you want to tell a riddle, right? Where is Walpole's oldest commercial ice house? On Ellis Pond in Norwood. All right? Not a lot of people know that. All right, and here's another one that people wanted me to look into. It's George Plimpton's farm pond. I'll show you where it is, and I think you'll get oriented. Very, very late, 1905 to 1935. It's probably where a lot of kids in the neighborhood learned to skate. So there was kind of a, it was well known in the neighborhood, let's put it that way, this pond. But it was also associated with the Lewis farm that's at the corner of Plimpton and East Street, toward East Walpole. And it was a certified farm. It was a thing in the 1920s and 30s to have a farm in which the milk went instantly onto ice, year-round, no matter what. It was went from the cow to ice, and it was on ice every single minute until it got delivered. That's what it meant to have a certified farm. There were a lot of rules that were being developed about that. And so I think what the story is on this little pond, which was called by the neighborhood kids The Secret. And Mike Milbury, the hockey player, grew up in this neighborhood. It's said that he learned to skate on this pond. Some of you know who I'm talking about, some don't. Here's Tanglewood East Street. Here's the Lewis farm. Before this little pond was formed in the 20th century, there was no farm pond around. So if you had cattle here, you'd have to take them all the way to the Neponset River across the railroad tracks to water them, all right? Everything I'm reading about this suggests that this was a farm pond. He had 80 head of cattle. Where are you going to give them water, right? So 80 head of cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens. This was a major, major farm, the Lewis farm. He dug this in the 20th century. I think it was primarily a farm pond. I don't think he was cutting ice on it. But did he have ice around? Yeah, he did. He had an ice house. So I had to sort that out a little bit. Was he cutting ice? No. I think he was buying artificial ice and storing it in an ice house so that he could run a proper dairy in the 20th century. All right, you can't see that pond anymore. It's behind a house. Here's the field where they dug the pond. So this is before the pond was dug. It was kind of a wetland area. So they dug it out and it became filled with water. That's the Lewis farm across the street. And then as I was researching the Plimptons and the Lewises, I did come across mention of a small ice house in the 1850s, but I need to put that into the context. That's the homestead on Plimpton Street. Very rich family, the Plimptons. Any well-off family in Walpole that had a pond was probably storing ice for household use, and I did not research all the little homesteads that might have had that. So yes, indeed, the homestead at 79 Plimpton Street had a little ice house for family use, which is a whole different thing. All right, so I suspect that people have never seen Smith's Pond in South Walpole. This is our final pond. 1895 to 1920 is pretty late in the game. And it starts off as Amos Hamilton's little ice house operation. Why? Because he had a little grocery store in South Walpole, and he had some butter and cheese and milk and stuff that he needed to keep on ice. And he would hire a gang from Bushnell's in Foxborough to come and do it for him, to come and get the ice out of there. By and by, the Bushnells got interested, as you'll see. So by 1897, the Bushnells said, we're going to make this a bigger operation. We're going to put in a bigger ice house. And by 1899, they had their first harvest. Again, late in the game, because the Bushnells were all over Foxborough and Canton. They had huge ponds. This was just an additional way for them to make a little extra money. This was not a major pond of theirs. All right, another ice house fire. See, here's another thing. Tramps would often, vagrants, tramps, people passing through town would often sleep in ice houses, let's say during the summer when there was, not too cold. And the newspaper article actually said there was no insurance and the ice could be saved. All right, end of the business. Frank Bushnell dies. It might have been continued a little bit longer, according to an interview we've got with Paul Kelly, the late Paul Kelly. But it was just a little side thing for the Bushnells. But now you're still going, where is this ice house, right? Where is the pond I'm talking about? Where's Smith's Pond? All right. So here's the Foxborough-Walpole border, yeah? In those days. It's going to change in a minute, don't worry. Here is the border. Smith's Pond goes down here. It's in Foxborough. Here's the channel. So it's a Walpole operation, but the pond itself was in Foxborough. Another picture, similar thing, purple, down at the bottom, Foxborough line there. By the way, there's Clark's Pond. That's also called the Post Office Pond. Clark's Pond down in South Walpole is the Clark Pond down there. Post Office Pond, there's Ruckaduck. So we're only seeing the channels coming across the border. So what right do I have to talk about it? Shouldn't the Foxborough Historical Society be dealing with that? Well, the ice house was in Walpole. And in the 1930s, they changed the town line. So here is the pond, and now fully half of it is in Walpole. Here's the brand new town line. Did you know that in 1930s, Foxborough gave up some land, and we got half of Smith Pond. Okay. By the way, where's the stadium? Right about there. Okay. So it is kind of our pond. And the ice house was in Walpole, so that's why I'm talking about it. But there's more. I got really intrigued with Smith Pond because I still couldn't see it. I would drive down there and go, where is it? Right? Where is it? Okay, so nowadays, stadium has caused major siltation. I won't get into exactly how that all happened, but it was, if you want to read about it, it's not a nice situation. And these lines here mean wetlands. So here's Washington Street. Here's part of the stadium. It goes down here, right? Gigantic complex. The Neponset River, unfortunately, goes kind of through the stadium. And here it is dumping silt all in this Smith's Pond, which, by the way, there's the Walpole-Foxborough border. All right. So you might remember my daughter has a drone. So I said, Alice, I want to see Smith's Pond. Okay, now this is going to take a little orientation. So there's a tailgating parking lot across the street from the stadium on Route 1. We were there on a non-game day, as you might imagine. See our little tiny silhouettes? So the three of us are there. The drone is like a few thousand feet up in the air. She sent it over Smith Pond, and here's the railroad tracks that go through South Walpole, yeah? So Route 1 is somewhere here. Washington Street Extension is up here. House on Water Street is here. And you can see how there's very little open water left in Smith Pond. There is some open water right here, but most of the pond is silted in. So at one point it was apparently a very interesting pond, and now less so. And that's on the Neponset River, by the way. All right, so another riddle. What pond in Foxborough could be considered a commercial ice pond in South Walpole? Answer, Smith Pond in South Walpole, which no one has ever seen. Thank you, Roger Turner Jr., 1932 to 2021. I knew nothing about ice harvesting until I started to talk to you. Thank you to all sorts of people. My husband Bob helps me a lot, and others whom I've already mentioned. Wouldn't you like to know about any correlations between cold weather and good ice harvest? I have an entire appendix on that. I did a lot of research on that. Would you like to know about some vaudeville theater folks who lived on an island, actually a peninsula, in Clark's Pond? Have a whole chapter on them. Want to know more about the island in Maury's Pond? I have an entire appendix on it, more than you want to know. Want to know a lot more about fancy skating? Got that. You want a complete thing on the Turner family? I know a lot about the Turners now. So I wrote a book. All right, so that's it. Thank you for listening. Questions?
What is that pond in back of St. Timothy's in Westwood coming down?
Oh, Willett Pond or New Pond. It's sometimes called New Pond, sometimes called Willett.
Pond.
Okay, so you're wondering about that because that is a nice big pond. So that is relatively new. It's why it's called New Pond. Roger Turner always called it New Pond.
I know Willett Street.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it was built in order to control water going downstream into Norwood for, I think, a leather tannery kind of an operation. But it just misses the dates in which people would have been saying, oh, let's cut ice here. I think if it had been dammed up maybe 20 or 30 years before, it would be irresistible for ice. And of course, now you know that that's all privately owned, so you can't even get near it easily. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
In Rick Steve's travelogue on Scotland, he has a segment which they talk about raising sheep, harvesting the wool,
Yeah.
and cleaning the wool. And the problem is that the sheep have a natural oil, lanolin,
Yes.
which creates a Mother Nature's raincoat where the sheep will have to live out in the wilds
Right.
all the time.
Yes.
And so that the problem of contamination, the sheep are good people, are not deliberately making things yucky. They need that. And that the problem of contamination is probably not so much lanolin itself, but the soaps which the commercial people add to dissolve out and wash away the lanolin.
I agree, but I am going to add sheep manure to that. So who's all grown up on a farm? I did. Okay, we had some sheep. And I'll tell you, if you don't take care of, if your sheep are extra woolly, not the meat kind, their back ends can get coated, especially if you've got a big operation. So there was manure involved as well. But I know what you mean. Compared to a lot of industries in Walpole, it seems not to be like the absolute worst thing. We had something far worse out here at the Union Privilege, right? Aren't we standing on a Superfund site right now? Yeah. So there's a different level of pollution that seems mild by comparison. I think there was also some political acrimony going on between the various mill owners as well. Yes.
How did they keep the ice cold?
With whatever materials were nearby. So in the case of Clark's Pond, it would be sawdust because the Clarks also ran a sawmill. So you would pack the ice in sawdust. But I happen to know that at Maury's Pond, Turner's Pond now, they were using hay. They were packing it because I guess they had fields around there where you had some, maybe not good quality hay. So those were the two major things. Some kind of hay or vegetation, but then sawdust was actually the best. It could last all the way deep into the summer. You'd have ice in an ice house right now. It's all about ventilation. Cold air sinks, warm air rises, and it's all about drainage. So these things had wonderful drainage. If an ice cube is sitting in its own water, it melts faster than if you keep the water drained away from it. So drainage, insulation, and then this constant venting of hot air out the top through these vents. So you would have ice well into the summertime. Yeah. Yep. And that's why they went up in fires, because the ventilation really has to be wonderful. Yeah, it's like a chimney, yeah. All right, other questions? Yes? What? Carberry? Oh, okay, so I did not come across any ice harv. Does that have another name, Seth? No ice harvesting. And I've also had people say, how about Cobb's Pond? Cobb's Pond is a 20th century pond. I'm not saying if these had been earlier ponds, maybe someone would have cut ice, but 20th century, no one was cutting ice anymore. If Carberry is a small pond, I'm going to say no, because it wouldn't be, yeah. Although there were small ponds all over the place that I identified associated with dairies. That would be an entire different lecture. Here's the dairy, here's the small pond, and they were doing something on a small scale. All right, other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah, so I'll get you.
When Lake Ave comes down,
Yeah,
the parking lot for that salmon pond,
yes,
there's a walkway that walks through there.
yeah.
Halfway through, there's a concrete structure there. Would that possibly been a scale house over there?
Are we talking about Diamond Pond or Clark's Pond? Because there is a scale,
Where the hub,
yeah, okay, that's Clark Pond.
parking.
There is a scale in there, and I do, absolutely, and I do identify it. And that you can easily see, it was a scale that they would use to drive the ice wagons up onto, and just as you were weighing something very heavy, you'd hit up kind of a pit beneath. Yes, that is an ice scale. I regret I didn't show a picture of it and mention it, but it's in the appendix of my book.
Been in one of the older pictures of that.
Yeah. Susan, did you have a question?
How thick did the ice need to be?
Good question. Okay, so they weren't going to, so you know, you can skate on ice that's a few inches thick. Well, they weren't going for that unless they really were desperate. They were going for 12, 14 inches if they could. And they were carefully grooming it. If the ice was rough, they would poke holes in it and flow water up over it to smooth it out, because this was they needed to sell this in a competitive way in Boston. So it couldn't be crummy ice, couldn't be ice with leaves and twigs in it, and it needed to be something that was going to form a block of 12 or 14 inches by 12 or 14 inches. I forget the dimensions. My father told me, because he grew up with an ice chest, it had to be a standard block size to put into an ice chest.
Did they harvest every year, or were
They tried to harvest every single year, yeah. So there were some years. Well, I can't correlate it, Susan. You'll have to read my appendix. I struggled mightily with the data to try to show anything going on whatsoever with temperature and ice. So no.
but when was the last time we had 12-inch thick ice?
Well, you can read my appendix. I have all kinds of. I mean, some years we had 12-inch. Some, and by the way, if they were desperate, they would cut it smaller. Yeah. Susan, I cannot correlate it with climate change. I'm sorry.
It just seems hard to believe it's not climate.
You read my appendix. Do you have my book yet? Read my appendix. Okay. All right. Other questions? All right. So this